It's Nerd Science Day. Let's talk about fermentations. I'm Daniel Whittington, Chancellor of Wizard Academy and Whiskey Marketing School. There's a question in the comments from Will Sharp, 9258, and he said, or she, can you talk more about fermentation times and the impact they have on the final product? I have noticed in Scotland that recently Billy Walker of Glenallachie and Lefroy with their Elements 2.0 have touched on extended fermentation times. Would be interesting to get more in depth. All right, I'm not gonna go as in depth as we would if you were taking one of the courses, of which there are many that do a great job of high level explanation. I'm gonna do sort of an overview of fermentation. And I think it's important because I would argue outside of the barrel, the vast majority of flavors you taste in whiskey are coming from the fermentation. And inside of a barrel, it's too dark to read. I can't believe that popped into my head. That's a Marx Brothers quote, if I remember correctly. Outside, or Mark Twain maybe? Yeah, outside of a book, a dog is man's best friend. And outside of a dog, a book is man's best friend. And inside of a dog, it's too dark to read. So how you ferment and the flavors that are created during fermentation, they change everything. They change how you make your cuts. They change what works best for the product, what kind of barrels you age in, can you finish it. Everything about it starts from this huge explosion of flavor that happens during fermentations. Now, first, let's talk about what a basic fermentation is. At its most basic, fermentation is when you take a porridge of grain and hot water, effectively, and the conversion rate of heat in the grain porridge, ground up grain, converts all of the starches in the grains into sugars. Now, not like table sugar, but sort of. And it's the kind of sugars that yeast love to eat. And then when you get this, you cool it down so that it's the perfect environment for happy yeast, and then you add yeast. And the yeast fall into this basically food bath. Now, in the beginning, they're pretty dormant, but then they switch from dormant to a metabolic activity when they realize, I'm surrounded by glorious food and the temperature's amazing, and the yeast go to work eating all of the sugars. Hey. Well, that's when we call fermentation. In the beginning, in that first window, as it starts to sort of like go from dormant to active, that's called the lag phase, and things start sort of rolling, and yeast start eating things, they start multiplying. And what yeast does is eat sugars, and then they poop out CO2, alcohol, and amino acids. Amino acids are the starting point for all of the congeners and esters that are all of the big, huge flavors that come in from a fermentation, or as we know them, flavor bombs. And they keep growing, they keep exploring, they keep expanding. The whole process of this first phase where they go from dormant to active and producing a lot of stuff and they're really going for it is like 2.5 days. So think 40 to 50, 60 hours, right? And then something new happens. If you stop right there, that's considered a really short fermentation. And if you stop there, you're gonna get really nutty, grain-forward, grain-like new make, because you haven't let the yeast do the next phase where a whole new level of interesting things happen. You've just had them do the first phase. A lot of distilleries will do sort of a medium, which is somewhere between 60 and 70, 75 hours. And that sort of is the halfway point. But any distillery looking for big, huge flavors and big, bold fruits and all of this vibrant kind of floral direction type stuff, these guys are going to go for really long fermentations, and there's a reason for that. But first, let's talk Tamnavulin. Tamnavulin is a Speyside distillery right in the dead middle of the Speyside region, and they were opened up in the 60s due to a bunch of demand for blended scotch and things like that, and this was a malt that went into a lot of blends. They got shuttered in 1995 and then stayed dormant for 12 years, reopened in 2007, and this is the malt that goes into the White and Mackay products, supposedly. So you get Invergordon grain and you get Tamnavulin, among others, into the blended scotches. So on its own, they've been starting to accent sort of like specialty aging products. And you can find these guys everywhere. And this one is a white wine Sauvignon Blanc finish. So it's American bourbon cask followed by Sauvignon Blanc. Oh, and if you want to talk long fermentations and fruit, Tamnavulin is already a fruity, kind of really lifted, light, and effervescent malt. Add on to that, finishing it in a Sauvignon Blanc barrel, and you get a whole other explosion of pear and peaches and cream. There's a sort of a dense, perfumey garden floral note that floats around behind things. This is entirely fresh fruit and mid-range dense honey cream. Just, there's not a lot of barrel tannin, there's not a lot of low-end heaviness, there's not a lot of overly bright, shiny tones. It's just pure mids at a really high density. That's dessert. It drinks exactly like it smells. Super dense honey, but like boutique honey that comes from honeysuckle flowers. Like bees are using honeysuckle flowers. And stewed fruits, but all light and pretty ones with maybe a little side of a little side of vanilla ice cream. Dessert, pretty, light, easy drinking. This is a great example of Speyside when it goes all in on this sort of summery, fresh fruitiness. And man, if you wanted to introduce someone to a Scotch who thinks that all Scotch is smoky, that would blow their minds. There's nothing more opposite of that than this. This is, yeah, a summer refreshment. Man, it almost feels like it's like carbonated or something. It's so light and sparkly. It's not my preferred direction for Scotch, but it is a really nice example of a really dessert, smooth, kind of sweet, pretty Scotch. Okay, so why long fermentations? Long fermentations give you more flavor, but more is not always better, as we've always learned with age. Things happen as a fermentation goes beyond the most efficient, most high alcohol and least amount of time. And in a distillery, efficiency is about how to get everything you want in the least amount of time and with the least amount of product. That's what efficiency is about. So we want the least amount of grain to accomplish a flavor. We want the least amount of time waiting on things to get high alcohol, and so on. But everywhere in a distillery, you face a choice. Do we go for maximum efficiency but no real flavors? Or do we be a little bit patient in this process and allow for the development of some complexity that will pay off in the long run? And fermentation is one of those moments where you can choose to just, right when you get the highest level of alcohol content, go, bam, done, get out of there, because all we want is high alcohol. And if you're making vodka, sure, why not? But if you're making pot still single malt, you want those flavors. So what happens is somewhere around the 60-ish hours, the creation of alcohol, new alcohol, and the rising of the alcohol content, 60-ish plus, sort of starts to die off. And that's about the highest level of alcohol content that you're going to get. After that, you're going to get new things, but you're not going to get higher alcohol content. If your goal is complexity, this is where you just pause and wait. When yeast runs out of food, it starts dying. And this is called autolysis. And this is when yeast just goes, I don't have any, and it's not, and then they die. And when they die, the membrane to their cell bursts. And everything that was in them sort of unleashes into the fermentation tank. And when you get that at a massive scale across, a crazy number of yeast cells, it creates all of these new flavor profiles. The two main things that you get are fatty acids and esters, right? So fatty acids are a biochemical reaction between sugars and the amino acids inside the yeast. These will generate aromas, but they will also generate mouthfeel and viscosity and density to the fermentation tank and then through to the still. Asters is what we're really looking for as well. Asters is everything responsible for all of the fruit explosion notes that you get on a really fruity single malt whiskey, or really any whiskey. Anytime you get real big fruit notes, that's going to come from this part of the fermentation process. Now, these are created from an elimination process and a reaction between acids and alcohols. And that's what we're really waiting for. But there is a point where the new things that are being created are not good flavors. It doesn't mean just like more and more and more and more and longer and longer and longer equals better. It's you got to check it and make sure that you're getting what you want. Because a lot of the things that you make in these fermentations are going to make it through all the way to the end product. You can't distill them out. You can make cuts to sort of select some things, but there's a point at which the fermentation starts making off notes or doubling down on things that it shouldn't and escalating them to a point where they're not what you wanted in the overall flavor profile. So you got to be real careful that you go long enough to get all the flavor you want and not so long that it turns into off flavors, because it turns out a lot of those won't age out. They'll just sit in that barrel forever, and you'll be trying to figure out how to blend them away later or just dump the cask. So I hope that gives you a sort of quick overview of why on fermentation and why it matters, and a little bit on how it works. Cheers to you. I'm really glad you're here. Hey, fruity flavors. If you like the fruity flavors, like and subscribe if you like the fruity flavors.